Hey, do you prefer to find the joy in life, or do you just want some help with that? If so, you're in the right place. So come on in and join the Joy Bunny clan. This is the My Slice of Life podcast. This week's mystery happened on the afternoon of November 24th, 1971. That's the day a man paid cash for a one-way ticket to Seattle on board Northwest Airlines Flight 305, which was going from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington. That man went on to hijack that plane, and its 35 passengers became his hostages. That in itself is no mystery, as hijackings were actually pretty common at the time. The mystery is that the man responsible for the crime has never been caught, and how he did it has puzzled people ever since. He should be known as Dan Cooper, but thanks to a journalist hearing incorrectly and being on a very tight deadline, today we know him as DB Cooper. Welcome folks to the My Slice of Life podcast. My name is Sharon and I am your very own Highland host, and this episode is the second and last in the mystery season of the podcast. There's quite a lot to this one, so I've tried to narrow it down, and I thought I had a theory. It didn't quite work out, but I'll tell you about it later on. So please, fasten your seatbelts and make sure your tray is in the upright position, for this could get a little bumpy. So back to Flight 305. It left Portland on time at 2:50 p.m, but soon after takeoff, a quiet man in his 40s and wearing a dark suit, white shirt and black tie handed a note to flight attendant Florence Schaffner. She was sitting in the jump seat at the rear of the plane, right behind the man, and she assumed the note was just his attempt to give her his phone number. No comments there about ego, so she put it unread into her bag. Seeing her do this though, the man, who we now know as DB Cooper, leans forward and whispered, "Miss, you better look at that note. I have a bomb." This was the same man who had ordered a bourbon and soda while they were waiting to take off. Then just 10 minutes or so later, here he was handing over that note and telling Miss Schaffner she was to sit with him. When she did, Cooper opened the cheap attaché case he had been carrying to show her a bundle of wires, red-coloured sticks and a battery, which did indeed look like a bomb. He told her he wanted her to write something down for him. A few minutes later, Schaffner was walking to the pilot with a note saying Cooper demanded 4 parachutes and $200,000 in $20 bills, which today would be about $1.5 million. And all that was to be delivered when he landed in Seattle. The 4 parachutes would give the impression he was going to take somebody with him, don't you think? So, did he say that to make it more likely he was going to be given fully operational parachutes? Not sure. So Schaffner took the note and the details were relayed by Captain Scott to Air Traffic Control, who then contacted the local police and the FBI. And while Schaffner stayed in the cockpit, flight attendant Tina Mucklow sat next to Cooper by his direction to be the liaison person between him and the flight crew who were still in the cockpit. Now, Cooper did make some additional demands. He said that upon landing in Seattle, the fuel trucks must meet the plane and all passengers must remain seated while the money was brought aboard. He said he would release the passengers after he had the money, and the last items to be brought on board were to be the 4 parachutes. Donald Nyrop, who was the president of Northwest Orient, agreed to pay the ransom and ordered all employees to cooperate with Cooper fully. The FBI obviously needed time to get the money and the parachutes sorted out and make sure emergency services were going to be on site, so Flight 305 circled, is it Puget Sound? So they were circling for around 2 hours to let the FBI get everything sorted out, including photographing every single banknote. The passengers, meanwhile, were being told their arrival in Seattle would be delayed because of a minor mechanical difficulty. All this time, Tina Mucklow sat with Cooper. She made some interesting observations about him, and after everything was over with, she reported he appeared familiar with the local terrain. He'd be looking out the window and saying things like, "Oh, that looks like Tacoma down there," as the aircraft flew over it. and when he was told that the parachutes were coming from McCord Air Force Base, he was able to correctly say that the Air Force Base was only a 20-minute drive from Seattle-Tacoma Airport. She also went on to describe his demeanour and said he wasn't nervous at all. In fact, he seemed rather nice and wasn't cruel or nasty. So, a nice Mr. Hijacker man then. Good to know. When the flight landed in Seattle, Cooper exchanged the flight's passengers for the money and parachutes, but several crew members did remain on board. Obviously, he needed somebody to fly it. When the final parachute was being brought into Cooper, he was apparently offered printed instructions on how to use them, but stated he didn't need them. Cooper then told the flight crew to refuel the aircraft and head to Mexico City with a refueling stop in Reno, Nevada. Now, I'm not going to go into all the technical details here because, to be honest, I wouldn't fully understand them, but the basics are that Cooper instructed the plane to be flown at the most minimum airspeed without stalling the aircraft, which I am reliably informed was approximately 110 knots, which would be 115 miles an hour, and at a maximum 10,000 feet, that's 3,000 metres altitude. I've been on planes in the past, hated it, but that's by the by. That does sound quite low even to me. However, Cooper seemed to know what he was doing, as he also specified the landing gear must remain deployed, the wing flaps must be lowered 15 degrees, and the cabin must remain unpressurised. So he has to be someone who flies planes, right? Otherwise, how would he know all this stuff? So off they went, but Cooper didn't know they were being followed by 2 F-106 fighters from McCord Air Force Base and a Lockheed T-33 trainer. All I know is that's a jet. The 3 jets did an S flight pattern to stay behind the slow-moving 727 plane and therefore out of Cooper's sight. But around 8 p.m, a cockpit warning light flashed indicating the aft staircase had been deployed, and the pilot used the cabin intercom to ask Cooper if he needed assistance. But Cooper's last message was a one-word reply. No. And he was never heard from again. The crew didn't even know if Cooper was still on board or not, but at 11:02 p.m, with the aft staircase still deployed, Flight 305 landed at Reno Tahoe International Airport. There was a thorough search of the plane, as you can imagine, but no sign of the bomb or DB Cooper could be found. And the only obvious conclusion is that the man, described by all as nondescript, had jumped from the plane, taking the money and the bomb with him. But what happened to him? Did he even survive the jump? And who was he anyway? I mean, the FBI had their work cut out for them. Between 1971 and 2016, they processed more than 1,000 serious suspects. And as you would expect, there was a massive investigation. The FBI managed to pick up 66 fingerprints and also recovered Cooper's black clip-on tie, the tie clip, and 2 of the 4 parachutes. They did find 2 hair samples on Cooper's seat, but one was destroyed after the FBI crime lab determined the sample lacked enough unique microscopic characteristics to be useful. The other hair sample got lost. They also found 8 cigarette butts and sent them to be tested. However, no fingerprints could be found on any of them, and when the FBI decided to use them later in 1998 to get DNA from them, they discovered all 8 of the butts had been destroyed. So eyewitnesses were interviewed and a series of sketches were drawn up. Local police and the FBI also immediately began questioning possible suspects, beginning with a poor Portland citizen named D.B. Cooper. He was quickly ruled out. The problem they had with regards to the search area was that due to a high range of variables like the plane's speed, wind factor, the altitude, when did Cooper actually jump, and so on, that made a potentially enormous area for them to search for him. And a massive area was searched by helicopter, and you had FBI agents as well as sheriff's deputies searching on foot. They went door to door. I mean, everything was going on. They even had patrol boats searching Lake Merwin and Yale Lake, but nothing was found. Further searches took place in the spring of 1972 and included Get this, teams of FBI agents, 200 soldiers from Fort Lewis, United States Air Force personnel, National Guardsmen and civilian volunteers. They even used a submarine to search the lakes, but nothing was found which would help to solve this crime. So, if you can't find the man, what do? You look for the money. A month after the hijacking, the FBI gave out lists of the ransom serial numbers to places like banks, casinos, racetracks, any business that would routinely conduct large cash transactions, and a reward was offered by Northwest Orient of 15% of any recovered money. But they still came up with nothing. I shouldn't laugh at this bit, but I will. The serial numbers were also released to the public, and that was when two very clever men printed counterfeit $20 bills and put the Cooper serial numbers on them. They used their fake money to then swindle $30,000 from a Newsweek reporter in exchange for an interview with a man they falsely claimed was the hijacker. That's what I call making the best out of a bad situation. Fair play to them. And earlier I mentioned that sketches had been drawn up, but they had problems too. The first one, known as Composite A, was completed a few days after the hijacking and was released on November the 28th, 1971, but many said it wasn't a good likeness. The second picture was apparently more accurate, but made him look too angry. Remember, this is Mr. Nice Hijacker Man, so can't be looking too angry. So this was changed again, and this third drawing was said to be a very close resemblance. Physical description was also given for D.B. Cooper based on the crew's interactions with them. He was said to be about 5'10", mid-40s, olive skin tone, brown eyes, but no clear accent which you could use to say where he was from. And initially the FBI profile of D.B. Cooper said he was a military-trained parachutist, not a sports skydiver. He seemed very familiar with how to use a parachute. Someone who kept physically fit, probably smoked about 1 pack of cigarettes a day, was more intelligent than a common criminal. It was also noted that Cooper knew about the aft staircase and knew it could be operated during flight. The FBI, as I mentioned, did have a lot of suspects, but I just want to give you a very quick rundown of the kind of people they were looking at. The first one is Theodore Burdett Braden Jr., or Ted Braden, born in Ohio, 1928, joined the military at the age of 16 in 1944, where he served with the 101st Airborne during World War II, and he was one of the military's best parachutists. He was a Special Forces Commando during the Vietnam War and a team leader within the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. Bit of a mouthful. And that was a classified commando unit of the Green Berets. However, in December 1966, Braden deserted his unit in Vietnam and made his way to the Congo to serve as a mercenary. He served there a brief time before being arrested by CIA agents and taken back to the US for a court-martial. There are quite a few shady things in his bio from here on, like, well, as if that wasn't bad enough, but things like driving an 18-wheeler full of stolen goods, driving a stolen vehicle with fictitious plates, and for doing all this and having no driver's licence. Physically, he was said to be 5'8" with a dark complexion from years of outdoor military service, short dark hair, medium athletic build, and was 43 years of age at the time of the hijacking. Another good candidate is Richard McCoy, who was born in 1942. He was also an army vet who also served in Vietnam, both as a demolition expert and later with the Green Berets as a helicopter pilot. When he left the army, he became a warrant officer in the Utah National Guard, and he was a keen recreational skydiver. He went on to carry out a copycat hijacking on April 7th, 1972, using a paperweight, which looked like a hand grenade, and an unloaded pistol. He also demanded 4 parachutes, but this time $500,000. He also jumped out of the plane, but left behind his handwritten hijacking instructions and his fingerprints on a magazine he'd been reading. He was arrested on the 9th of April. By all accounts, though, there wasn't enough evidence to link the crime to anyone in particular, even people with these backgrounds. I mean, I read them and I'm thinking, oh, it was definitely him. Oh, it was definitely him. Or probably both of them working together. That wasn't my main theory, by the way, but when you hear these things and the skills these people have, it really does make you wonder. Anyway, despite all the searching and investigating, there were many who believed D.B. Cooper didn't survive after he jumped out of that plane. They say he didn't have all the necessary equipment for the jump or surviving out in the wild, even if he did land safely. He was only dressed in a suit after all, not exactly ideal for dealing with the elements at 10,000 feet. The weather on the night of the hijacking wasn't great, and the area he jumped into was less than ideal. Also, none of the money was ever spent. There is also talk of the fact that of the 2 parachutes he was given, one of them was sewn shut, and the other one was a military one. So make of that what you will. But, having said all of that, there's never been any conclusive evidence found of his death either. So they never found a body. But then if you don't know who you're looking for, how do you know who you haven't found? Do you know what I mean? You don't know if you haven't found him, because you didn't know who he was. Anyway, a small amount of the money was eventually found by an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram on February 10th, 1980, when he was on holiday with his family on the Columbia River. They were staying at a beachfront known as Tina Bar, about 9 miles downstream from Vancouver, Washington. Brian's find totalled about $5,800, and FBI technicians confirmed the money was indeed a portion of the ransom money. And Brian did get to keep a couple of the notes too, so that was nice. In 2016, the FBI officially suspended investigation of the case, and the aviation world had also made some changes. Yes, thank you, Mr. Cooper. So metal detectors were installed at airports, baggage inspection became mandatory, and passengers who paid cash for tickets on the day of departure were selected for additional scrutiny. Also, on top of that, Boeing 727s were retrofitted with something called Cooper vanes, which were specifically designed to prevent this aft staircase from being lowered in flight. The hijacking by D.B. Cooper, or Dan Cooper, whatever you want to call him, remains the only unsolved case of air piracy in the history of commercial aviation, which I find quite amazing, to be honest. But if you were paying attention at the start, I did say I may have had a theory of my own, but after doing a lot of reading on the subject, I don't think it stands, but I'll tell you anyway. I mean, I know it doesn't stand, but I'll tell you. I had thought, initially, that if it had only been the crew who were interviewed about what D.B. Cooper looked like, and maybe there hadn't been any other passengers, or very few passengers on board, who maybe, weren't even interviewed, then maybe, this is just my mind, but maybe he had never existed in the first place. Maybe the crew were so sick of being hijacked they decided to stage one to make a few extra bucks. But after finding out other passengers were on board and had seen him, and apparently somebody had interacted with them and they were all interviewed, that kind of blew my theory out the water. Never mind. And that brings us to the end of this week's Mystery Friends. Thank you for your company this week, and feel free to let me know your thoughts on this one. Was he just a smart, cool guy? A master criminal? Or do you have another theory? Don't forget to come back next week for the last episode of the mystery season. But until then, Joy Bunnies, as always, you take care of yourself.